A report in the Daily Beast raised the hilarious but ridiculous question, is Glenn Greenwald the new master of right-wing media? Journalist Matt Taibbi assessed this crucifixion of Greenwald, saying that the first response to any criticism of the mainstream media is to accuse people of being aligned with the right. But these new elitist political rules of the resistance era have sparked unlikely allies among Republicans and Democrats. Matt Taibbi joins us now to discuss further. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on.
You know, this is a little bit meta, and I have to ask you, does it make you queasy to talk to somebody from the Federalist?
No, not at all. No.
Yeah,
in fact, and it might have a couple of years ago, but not really.
Right, and that's an important point, and that's what you have a fantastic essay on your Substack about all of this, and it basically gets at the common cause you write about against the, quote, epistemic revolution that the left and the right, I guess more of like the populist left and the right, have found amid this era of, you know, the knowledge being too dangerous for the rabble, as you put it, and harken back to Pluto and all of that good stuff. So can you break down basically... Yeah, it's super meta. But can you break down basically the argument about, like, what is this epistemic revolution? What does it look like? And why, then, is there common cause between the Federalist and Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald?
Yeah, I think, you know, the issue for me is really symbolized in the approach to censorship, which has become a big thing, obviously, in the last couple of years. I started to think about this a lot, especially after Alex Jones got kicked off the internet. And there was this an initial response by people who I think 15 or 20 years ago would have been kind of down the line traditional ACLU liberals who might have been a little unnerved by it, even if they couldn't stand Alex Jones. This idea of having a private oligarchical sort of control over speech normally would have upset liberals once upon a time. But then in the Trump era, I think there's been kind of a significant philosophical shift to, you know, just some things are just too dangerous. Some people are just too dangerous to allow to have civil liberties. And what we really need is a group of enlightened experts. Experts is a big term on the left now.
Capital E.
We need to put, yeah, with a capital E, or as John Carl of ABC put it the other day, talking about the Labley theorem, quote, serious people. We need those people kind of in charge of making sure that only certain people have access to information. And I think, again, this is it's a different way of looking at things than I think liberals would have looked at it maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And as a result, you know, there are now a number of people who would formerly have been political enemies who are now saying the same thing, which is, you know, we disagree with that kind of elitist approach to the situation.
And I think the elitism also sort of creates a demand for people like you and the Federalists and myself to just talk at all, because it's not, you know, it has been deemed too dangerous by so many people in these elite positions of power. And you break down the example in this essay on your Substack, which is fantastic, of Michael Isikoff's conversation with Frank Meyer, in which I alluded to it earlier. He asked him if he feels a little queasy that right-wing news outlets were the only people really covering his book. And what's interesting about that is Isikoff is one of the people implicated in Meyer's reporting and in having gotten those sort of early indications that the Russia collusion narrative was false. Isikoff was on the wrong side of that entire thing. Can you speak to where, you know, you think he finds the audacity to ask that question to somebody like Meyer when Meyer is identifying something that was just sort of objectively wrong? He's addressing it. So what's so wrong with at least having that conversation and other people agreeing with basically the facts?
Well, first of all, I should say, you know, I always try to go out of my way to point out that Michael Isikoff, you know, even though I had differences with him about the reporting on this stuff, he at least answers questions about his reporting on Russiagate, and he's made himself publicly available. So I try to give him credit for that.
100%.
And, you know, the fact that he even had this conversation with Meyer is kind of extraordinary in itself. But essentially what he was saying was what's unspoken in the community, which is the journalistic community, which is that if you do reporting and it helps Donald Trump, or it's perceived to help that side, you're supposed to feel a little bit nervous about it. And if the only people who are re-reporting your work are in the Federalist or or it's Fox News or the Daily Caller, normally that's supposed to be a source of alarm. But the reality of the situation is, look at Barry Meyer. He's a longtime New York Times reporter. He's as solid as they get. He's just written an excellent book that's it's sort of researched extremely well, and there's nothing wrong with his reporting, but it's not getting picked up in any of the mainstream outlets or the non-conservative outlets because politically it sends the wrong message. So what Isikoff is basically trying to say is, how do you feel about that, right? Like, do you want to be left out of the party? Do you want to be excluded? Because that's the unspoken threat of the journalistic community right now.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it also raises the question of sort of what the impetus for the common cause between maybe the populist or anti-establishment left and the anti-establishment right is, because it seems as though the calculus is that basically all of these other things are downstream. Like, if we cannot restore the fundamental agreement and consensus on free speech and free expression and censorship, then we can't even have these other disagreements about market economies and imperialism and foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's an accurate way to sort of look at why the left and the right come together? Because it really, there may be more ideological consensus these days in the populist era than there previously was, but at the same time, there's these huge differences and these huge gaps still exist. But if you can't even have those disagreements if you can't at least you get past censorship.
Yeah, I think that's right. There are enormous differences. I would say politically, I probably don't agree with really anything that that the modern Republican Party is in favor of, except for a couple of things like these issues on censorship. But you're right. The debate right now is, should we work to try to restore the basic institutions that allowed us to have a free dialogue previously? Or should we just wall up into different tribes and fight each other and not worry about what's true and what's not, and just go at it as combatants? Because that's essentially the way I think things played out in the Trump era. Like there were a lot of reporters who committed themselves to this idea of, well, maybe there were things about the Russiagate story that weren't correct, but it's okay because it's Donald Trump on the other side of it, so I'm not going to worry about that. Whereas old school reporters would have been deeply troubled by that phenomenon, right? So I think you have to. I think what we're in a fight over is whether or not there is going to be that dialogue at all. And that's the question. Like we can have the fight about the other stuff later, but we have to have that possibility open first.
Yeah, when you boil it down, it seems to be at its essence about priorities, like ideological priorities, and both the left and the right have made the decision to sort of prioritize, and I think the correct one, just our ability to have these conversations in the first place above the other stuff. And that gets to where you end your essay is oddly optimistic. I think for these days, you say there's a possibility that we can unite, and the left actually may be engaged in a self-defeating, and I shouldn't just say the left, this is really the political establishment in general, may be engaged in a self-defeating effort here to crack down on the knowledge that's too dangerous for the rabble, because what it actually might be doing is uniting the rabble into a much more powerful force. So how do you convince folks on the left who may have these really intense disagreements with the right on what they see as fundamental issues on things like human rights and sex and gender, et cetera, that it's worth the sort of cost-benefit analysis of aligning with the right on this particular issue to get past the roadblock of free expression that we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term the left. I'm always really careful not to do that, because I think what we're really talking about here is the political establishment, which is, to me, it's not ideological. It's corporate. It's really the divisions are more about sort of insiders versus outsiders, or dependents versus independents. And I started to notice as a campaign reporter, even 10 to 15 years ago, that there were people on both the Democratic and Republican side who were increasingly frustrated with the feeling of sort of alienation from institutional America. They felt like they were on the outside of things, that they didn't have a role in the decision making of the country, that they were that the sort of upper class was getting a bigger and bigger share of the wealth, and they were being increasingly left out. And it's on those points that people on the left and right legitimately do have some common interests. There are a lot of similarities between the movements like the Bernie Sanders movement and, say, the Trump movement. Now, they disagree sort of violently about other things, but I think what they have in common is a disdain for the politics of the 1%, right? It's that very narrow slice of people who have most of the money, most of the control over institutions, and most of the political power in this country. And I think what those people worry about most of all is any kind of dialogue between the sort of populist movements on the left and right.
Yeah, so if you were talking to Michael Isikoff face to face and he had thrown the question to you that he had thrown to Barry Meyer, I accidentally called him Frank earlier. I'm not used to waking up at 6 in the morning. But if you're face to face with him and you have to make the argument that, like, look, this is worth it. Like, you should be taking yourself to Fox News. You should go on Tucker's show to sort of animate people who care about the same foundational principle that you do, even though you disagree with them on all these other issues. What's the way to persuade people to sort of like actually get past those mental hurdles?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time it's been essentially a threat that is hanging over your head. Like if you appear in any of those other outlets, you may end up having yourself disinvited from the green rooms of MSNBC or CNN or whatever it is, and that's a real thing that people have to consider for their careers. They don't want to be locked out of publishing opportunities, speaking opportunities, appearances on if they have to promote something. But the reality is, you should never think in terms of only speaking to half the country or a quarter of the country. I think any real journalist wants to talk to everybody and wants to try to convince everybody. And so you shouldn't be afraid, I don't think, of going on conservative media as long as you don't, violate your own principles when you're on there and you say what you believe. If they offer something you disagree with, you should say it, but you shouldn't be afraid to speak your mind anywhere. And I think that's a principle that a lot of journalists are deviating from now. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us this morning. No, thank you so much for having me on. Absolutely. Make sure you read the essay. It's really good. And subscribe to Matt's Substack, which is also wonderful. We'll have more Rising for you after this.